Very welcome to this morning where we will deal with various aspects of German cultural diplomacy. I have been asked to make the start. Professor Ole Bruckner will then take over and the morning goes on. Now, we are a little bit late yet, so I run right into business. This is a picture some of you may recognize, some of you may have seen. This is what some of us call a turning point as far as Germany and Germany's image in the world are concerned. Yes? Well, if it's not clear, this is probably because it's a very bright room, so I hope some other pictures might be more clear. Anyway, I should have mentioned, perhaps, since there was no other introduction, I'm Karl-Erik Normann. That's my name, and I was a Swedish ambassador before, and I'm now one of the guest professors here at the ICD, particularly for the MA students from various parts of the world. So I'm not German, but I live here partly since 15 years. I have a German wife. So this was the World Championships in football in 2006. Some of you who have time to walk around in Berlin will know that this is the very long, very large streets, 17. Juni, from Brandenburger Tor and westwards. It's a very, you can, on this picture, you probably find almost 1 million people. So this is, was this enormous event of World Championships in 2006, where the whole world came and all of a sudden started loving Germany, which is rather sensational, at least for a person of my generation who have been, let's say, seen so many ups and downs as far as the image of Germany is concerned in the world. Now, let us take one step back and see what German image and German cultural diplomacy was like in the 19th century. We have a few very strong names here to take care of. We have the brothers Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt. You are certainly aware of the Humboldt University, which was founded by Wilhelm von Humboldt. And the other brother was one of the great explorers and discoverers and scientists, particularly interested in Latin America and contributing a lot to, let's say, human knowledge about these parts of the world. We have another similar explorer, namely Heinrich Schliemann, who was the person who let's say, discovered Troja and started the archaeological excavations there and put Troja on the, let's say, on the historical map for sure. It was, of course, already there since the old stories and mythology of the Greeks, etc. But he made it coming really concretely into life, where, you know, it is there on the western coast of Turkey. Edward Bernstein, not everybody of you, does anybody know who Edward Bernstein was? I say we are speaking now 1860, 1870 and so on. He was one of the founding fathers of international social democracy. Because there was then for a long period of time a fight about the right interpretation of socialism or of communism, as Karl Marx had just a few decades earlier written his Communist Manifesto. But Bernstein had this so-called revisionist aspect, where you say we shall reach this kind of social equality, etc., economic equality through reforms rather than revolution. And Edward Bernstein was in that sense, he was, I think, a locomotive driver from Berlin. And he became a very important figure also, for instance, for Scandinavian social democrats. And then for a very short period, Germany was also a colonial city. We have discussed with my MA classes the role of colonialism, which is, of course, a very dirty form of cultural diplomacy, you might call it. And sometimes you leave only bad footprints. In some cases, you leave some good footprints as well. But the German history of colonialism was only 30 years long, starting in the 1880s and ending by the end of the First World War, 1918, 1919. And very few tracks or very few footprints were left around the world. But one important thing was left, and that was the German beer culture in China. Because that was one of the technical knowledge that they brought. So a piece of a rather successful cultural diplomacy in that particular sense. You should be aware that all these things, I know Humboldt was before, but the others was during this so-called Second Deutsches Reich. Everybody speaks about the Third Reich and Hitler and so on, and some people are aware of the First Reich because that was the Holy Roman Empire with a seat mainly in Vienna. But there is a Second Deutsches Reich as well, and that is between January 1871, when the Bismarck and the German troops had won the war against France, a very short war. But so in January 1871, you could declare the second German Reich with a German Kaiser in Versailles, of all places, to be a new leading European power. And that went on then till the end of the First World War. So during that, before that, of course, Germany had been split into several small kingdoms. The most important and let's say the winning one was Prussia, where Bismarck came from Prussia, and then also the Kaiser dynasty was also Prussian, basically. So you could say they conquered other parts of Germany and forced them into this common Reich, the empire. When the First World War finished and the German Second Reich went down the drain, like all other empires, also, by the way, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all of them lost and disappeared, more or less. And we had an interesting period between 1919 and, I should say, till the end of the Second World War. First in the 20s, well, we had in Germany, there was the so-called Weimar Republic. It was again back to democracy. Well, when was democracy? I say back because Germany had a certain democratic tradition. In the revolutionary years of 1848 and 49, Germany, took a very ambitious democratic institution in Frankfurt. But unfortunately, this constitution never had a chance to be tested in real life. But the theory was there, and the ideas were there. The ideas were also some of understream, even through the Second Empire. But in the 20s, this so-called Weimar Republic, you had a democratic system. People had just achieved suffrage. Everybody was allowed to vote. And there were several parties. But it became this period of the 20s until 1933 became more and more complicated. There was two sides, you could say. There are many sides of it, of course, but one side was both the feelings and the results of the First World War. Lost the war, having an enormous war debt to pay, and very much material and psychologically destroyed. So, and you had this famous inflation where money was worth nothing for a moment, and you had unemployment, and you had a lot of social problems in this Weimar Republic of the 1920s. At the same time, it was a symbol for this happy life, this roaring 20s, as we are talking about it in perspective. The roaring 20s with a wild nightlife and a very liberal attitude to party and sex, and also kind of a first effort in the LGBT movement, you could say, which was then dropped during coming regimes, of course. But so Berlin was really one of the symbols of the roaring 20s, a wild city. There's James Bond, by the way. Yeah. So, yeah. So this was a very intensive period in, you could say, German cultural diplomacy, because this was also the birth of film, the German version of film with Fritz Lang, etc. And it was an extremely active period. German theater, German film, literature, everything was flourishing. And on the other side of the medal was this very difficult social situation, which gave the chance to the Nazis to take over, simply saying, democracy doesn't function, we now have to have a strong hand, and Hitler took over. And his propaganda minister was Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels, you could say, to some extent, one of the early, really conscious cultural diplomats, of course, as propaganda chef. And conscious, I'm saying, because they used all the modern methods of cultural diplomacy. Radio was rather new, film was very much incoming, and then also mass events. So you have all these instruments that are typical instruments for cultural diplomacy were used to 100% by the Nazis during this extremely short period, 12 years period. They succeeded in destroying half the world. 55 million people died, 6 million Jews and other opposers were killed, and an enormous historical footprint, a very bad footprint, of course, but they used the instruments of cultural diplomacy in a very conscious way. They used and abused, I would rather say, they abused Richard Wagner, for instance. Well, then some people say, well, Wagner, he was anti-Semite anyway. So he was, of course, the perfect symbol for Nazism. But on the other hand, if you look back at the 19th century, you will find that most, or a big lot of cultural personalities, composers, authors, etc., they were also anti-Semite. So you cannot blame Wagner for what Hitler and Himmler and company did. But he was abused. Sara Leander, a Swedish actress, was taken to Babelsberg here in Berlin to become the big heroine in German film. Why did they take a Swedish actress? Well, first, because the one they should have taken, the natural candidate, Marlene Dietrich, she had left and didn't want to be part of this propaganda machinery. She left and took a very strong position against the Nazis all through their rule. So Goebbels needed somebody else, and he succeeded in getting Sara Leander, giving her, so to say, an offer she couldn't refuse, a lot of money and some very interesting roles, and that was of course, something that she, after the war, was blamed for a lot. But that's another story. Anyway, during the last 12 years of this period, the role of propaganda as cultural diplomacy was extremely strong. Germany was definitely very well known for, let's say, we can be rather exact here. I would say until about autumn 1942, Germany was rather popular all over the world because it was a success story, and including the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936, and including all the other things, including also winning the first parts of the Second World War. But from the autumn of 1942, when things started going bad, down in North Africa, in Stalingrad, etc., then world opinion changed, and changed drastically until it was finally the end of this rule. The end of the Nazi rule and the Second World War created, as you all know, a new world situation. A Cold War started between the East and the West. You have the Washington on one side, and you have Moscow on the other side, and Germany in the middle of it, a divided Germany. Not only a divided Berlin, so if you look at the map and a little bit into the red part there of Germany, you have Berlin in the middle of that one. So there was a two-dimensional or three-dimensional wall between East and West at the time. And this meant that the two Germanys both became symbols, because they are central in Europe also, and because of the role in the Second World War, etc., etc. Berlin West became the symbol for freedom and free market and so on. And Berlin East became the symbol for socialism and, as they said, social justice, because they said at the others on the west side, it's capitalism. Now, both these parts of Berlin could enjoy privileges of various kinds, less military service, less tax, etc., because they were encouraged to be there and to be on this barricade of freedom or barricade of socialism. So from 1970 then, a little bit of an appeasement starts with Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. There it is the first efforts to try to build a bridge over the wall, so to say. And we see a kind of peaceful coexistence between West Germany and East Germany. This kind of peaceful coexistence is a very well-known cultural diplomacy term already, because it had been working from the 1950s between Moscow and Washington, between East and West, was part of the Cold War, was part of an effort to avoid a complete stalemate in the relations given the terror balance and the atomic weapons on both sides, etc. But this peaceful coexistence were now also spilled over a little bit on the East-West German relations. And interesting to be aware of is that the capital of West Germany, Bonn, always considered East Germany, DDR, as occupied. They didn't recognize East Germany as a nation, as an independent nation. It's occupied. If you look today at Crimea from the spring 2014, Russia went into Crimea, and that is, I guess, the whole Western Europe will, or most of Europe will consider Crimea as occupied by Russia and not part of Russia. So there is a certain historical parallel here. Bonn became one other symbol, of course, for West, and East Berlin was the capital of East Germany. An example in the cultural field was that Goethe was considered West German, for good reasons, because he was born in Frankfurt am Main by West Germans. But in East Germany, said he is from Weimar because he spent a lot of his time in Weimar. So this was this competition about the great German cultural symbol. Today's Germany, it's very evident. You put the unified Germany in the middle of Europe. It's a very clear role. Well, you see the map like this, I think it's no doubt what role that Germany can play. And Germany's global role today, the first thing, the pacifists, it was in the autumn of 2002, 2002, that George W. Bush was preparing the invasion in Iraq. Gerhard Schröder, the Bundeskanzler in Germany, was against this war, didn't want to participate. Neither did the French. At a press conference, the President Bush got the question, why don't our allies Germany want to follow in this important mission? Well, said Bush, and thought a little bit, well, you know, the Germans are pacifists. It's a quotation from Bush. They are pacifists. And of course, again, for a person of my generation with a little bit of historic perspective, it's a rather shocking statement, but it's true. There are clear pacifistic tendencies in Germany due to history, of course. They don't want to be involved, particularly not in such stupid games like the Iraq War. Now, in the European, on the European stage, of course, Germany is considered, since a long time, the motor. You notice that in almost all issues, financial, political, environmental, whatever. Because Germany's identity is European. I think we will hear more about Germany and Europe later, but the identity for Germans has been in the last half century very much European, because they don't want to seem too nationalistic. Let's say the world had enough of a nationalistic Germany. So here is Germany as the motor of Europe, Germany as the guarantee for a kind of a European peace. And that is the identity of Germany, except for these events that I mentioned at the outset in sports. Of course, then they're called Deutschland. That is then an exception, I would say. So, and the German federal state, 16 Bundesländer, that is the kind of guarantee which was also inherited from the Weimar Republic and from earlier parts of German history, a guarantee against a kind of Reich empire thinking, distributed power to various capitals around Germany. with a considerable decision power in various fields, like culture and education, for instance. And then I consider Germany as world champion in national therapy, because, and that has to do, of course, particularly with the Nazi time. You can still, in each media, each newspapers, radio, television, film, and so on, there's always something new coming up about these terrible years. And it is really a very serious effort and a kind of a fascination about how could it be so bad? How could they behave like they did? And so on. That is going on all the time, and I think the Germans are really worth all respect, merit all respect for that therapy, because there are other bad guys in history, even let's say, allies of Germany like Austria and so on, who have not done very much in that particular therapy field, so on. They also, due to the experiences of the Second World War and the Holocaust, Germany has become Israel's best friends. And I know, for instance, because I commute between Berlin and Stockholm. So when 2-3 years ago, there was this one of these small wars between Israel and Palestine, Gaza. In Stockholm, it was a war about Israel bombing Palestine and destroying Palestine. In Berlin, it was a war about Israel not anymore being accepting the daily missile shooting from Gaza to Israel. So there were two, from a Berlin perspective and a Stockholm perspective, two different wars. It was the same, however. So Israel can always rely on Germany for a kind of solidarity. Germany has also, partly due to these historical experiences, become a champion of democracy, of tolerance, of openness, and of freedom. And not to speak about the culture, of course, where Germany definitely is core. One of my main reasons for living in Berlin is that here is where culture, arts and culture have it. It's a world capital, really. Here's the symbol, of course, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, living about 200 years ago. And he has said, he is very important, of course, in German cultural diplomacy. He did not only write Faust, of course. Faust is very much a symbol for human ambition. Where are the limits for human ambition? With whom are you prepared to sign a contract in order to achieve your desires and wishes? But then, speaking and writing German, we should be aware that the German language was a leading academic language up till 1940. I know that up in Sweden, for instance, if you had an academic work you have written, and you should write a summary. Up till 1940, you wrote this summary in German, if you wanted it to, let's say, become international. From the World War disaster, all of that disappeared, including the language. So if my parents' generation spoke German as first foreign language, my sons' and daughters' generation speak German, if possible, if at all, as fourth or fifth language. So it had a disastrous effect on the role of the German language in the world. But the Goethe Institute tries to repair this. You know, there are 159, I think, Goethe Institutes around the world, and they are increasing because things are going rather well in Germany, so Germany is popular, people want to come here, and in order to come here, they know they should learn German. So it's a boom now for learning German around the world in these Goethe Institutes. But it will take some time. Anyway, some 100 people, the Germany themselves, plus Austria, plus people in Switzerland and Luxembourg, and also some other parts of Central Europe are speaking German. So we might see a renaissance of German language, but basically speaking, of course, they, as well, the Germans, as well as the French, lost the language battle against English, of course, and this happened already in the 1950s. And that's why here, not many people in this room are UK citizens, I presume, but we are all communicating here with, in this. As I say, we all speak bad English. So, Land der Dichter und Denker, the land of poets and thinkers. Here are two rather different characters. To the left you find the Grimm Brothers, you know, with the fairy tales. All these fairy tales. Most of us, I must confess, know these fairy tales through Walt Disney. Because the Disney has filmed almost all of these famous stories. But anyway, they were really legendary German cultural diplomats, you could say, in the early 19th century. And one of the brothers, as a matter of fact, was one of the co-authors of that Frankfurt Constitution that I mentioned some minutes ago. So also took a political responsibility. The guy to only, well, I guess Uli will recognize the guy to the right. I don't know if anybody else, only those of you who happen to be in room. He is very famous right now. He's, let's say, a comedian. His name is Böhmermann, and he wrote 2 weeks ago, he wrote a very dirty poem about President Erdogan. And that upset Mr. Erdogan a lot, so he sued him, which some people, well, this made, let's say, German comedians and cartoonists and so on laugh even more. Of course, that he doesn't even have that kind of, let's say, tolerance. So, and so Böhmermann is, for me, a rather typical exponent of a strong German tradition of caricature and comedy and, well, free speech. Germany is definitely the land of philosophy and free speech, except for these periods, this 12-year period of the Nazis, and you would have to say also the 40-year period of GDR, where free speech was not really encouraged. Next year, or already from 31st of October this year, Germany and some other parts of at least Northern Europe will celebrate Martin Luther. 500 years after his declaration, when he took distanced himself from the Catholic Church. But of course, this had an enormous effect. So he will certainly be celebrated during the coming year for also a kind of a German cultural diplomat. He was important also for giving for the German language, because he wrote the Bible in the German language and so on, but also for this new version of Christianity. So a very important theological or philosopher. And then Karl Marx, of course, economic historian. He doesn't, perhaps there's a kind of a revival for Marx right now. You see some tendencies around the world that, after all, there might be a revival for some sort of Karl Marx interpretation. You had the great philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, and you had the, let's say, political philosopher Max Weber, and of course then you have the strong, in the 20th century, the strong authors, Nobel Prize winners, Thomas Mann, who also belonged to those who left Germany when Hitler took power. So he left and distanced himself and even spoke against Hitler from his new homeland in England. Heinrich Böll, also Nobel Prize winner, and Günter Grass, who died the other year, very strong personalities. Jürgen Habermas, a philosopher, and I quote him because he's both a very interesting philosopher and also because he was one of the first who noted, some 15 years ago, noted that we are now entering the post-secular era, when again religion is again coming back, taking an important role after filling the gap that was left when some political ideologies went down the drain. And again, the cabaret, the provocation tradition, very strong in Germany. German music, that is the real reason why I am here. I'm myself a musician also. My wife is an opera singer. She sings stuff from the right guy there. The German music is, of course, this is the land of classical music, most definitely. The father, we always call Johann Sebastian Bach, the father of classical music, or music also, music as such. Jazz musicians, pop musicians also refer to Bach because he invented a lot of musical technique which were absolutely important. And Richard Wagner, of course, legendary. Now, so the tradition is strong. From Bach to Udo Lindenberg. Lindenberg is a very popular artist. He went 70 the other day, but he's still going strong. Germany has more than 80 opera houses. That's by far a world record. More than 130 orchestras, classical orchestras. I'm speaking publicly financed opera houses and classical opera. Then comes also a certain vegetation of free groups, etc. But publicly financed, so it is, which means it's a political priority to support this music. Bach, Beethoven, Wagner, Johannes Brahms, Richard Strauss. 1/3 of all working orchestra musicians are in Germany. Can you imagine? Well, some of them have come here from China or from Latin America or from North America and so on. But 1/3, yes. So there are good reasons to be in Germany if you like to play or to listen to classical music. But there is also the other side of the music, the more popular side. You have Kraftwerk, absolutely icons from the 1970s, 1980s, and still going strong very much. They are as good as ever. Or you have the symbol, more or less, the Scorpions, another German group who became a little bit of a symbol in connection with the Wende when the Berlin Wall fell. The consequences of this Wende, 9th November, Berlin Wall fall, and then the year after, 3rd of October, united Germany. The consequences we still see. You still speak about Ossis and Wessis. Ossis are the East guys, Wessis are the West guys. You still hear Ossis complaining about the Wessis having occupied East Germany, more or less. Occupied both in terms of economy, politics, and in values, etc. And Wessis complaining about the Ossis, that they are always complaining, or that they are not up to Western energy standards somehow. There are differences always also in the level of economy, level of income, etc. There's still some 100 to 80 in terms of economic differences. And still, when you, for instance, have negotiations between trade unions and employers, you have to make a certain East Germany application, or the 6 Neue Bundesländer, as they say, an application to this to give the eastern part a little bit more in order to, in the long term, adjust these differences as much as possible. So, and then we have an interesting thing in foreign policy. after all, don't forget that in East Germany they were part of the Moscow Empire, certainly. They were part of the Warsaw Pact, etc. They did not like NATO. Of course, you are born with that, and it's not so easy to change that. So you will find a lot of NATO skepticism in Eastern Germany still, whereas in Western Germany they still have this affiliation. The West or America were those who saved us from Hitler, more or less. So these differences you find, and mostly in the last 25 years, I have had the feeling as a diplomat that they have succeeded in finding a kind of a synthesis between the Western version and the Eastern version of the world. But when certain questions come up, there seems again to be some kind of a split back in the minds of people. And that's an interesting thing. We notice this, for instance, when we come to the relation to Russia, generally speaking, and when we discuss the refugee situation, the present refugee situation, that there is less understanding in East Germany for the liberal refugee policy of the government, and more understanding on the Western side. So then there is one thing, a word which has been accepted also by the English language and most other languages, namely realpolitik. Realpolitik for me is the kind of politics represented by Bismarck in the Second Reich, but today it means simply looking at the map, trying to make the best of the situation, and for a moment forget about the ideological or even to some extent human rights dimensions. So realpolitik is something which still has a certain tradition in Russia. I think the present foreign minister of Germany, Mr. Steinmeier, I guess some of you saw him yesterday probably, he's a very good example of this kind of realpolitik feeling. We are upset about Russia's behavior in Ukraine and so on, but they are there where they are. We can't change the map. We have to live with it somehow. So in the same spirit as Willy Brandt in the 1970s, we have to somehow deal with them. We have to talk with them. The late foreign minister Genscher, who died the other week, always said also, you can't discuss Europe without having Russia in mind somehow. And you have to deal with it. You can't be always only antagonistic. You have to be realistic. So what is also happening, and Steinmeier is a good example of that, to some extent Merkel as well, but Steinmeier I would say particularly, is that there is a little bit higher diplomatic profile of Germany now. Because up till, well, shall we say 5 or 10 years ago, you would say Germany is a great economic power, you know, almost world champions in exportation, and a cultural power, of course, but in foreign policy, no, not very much. So, but that has changed a little bit, partly because there is such a need for some sort of realpolitik voice in European politics and in world politics. So they have taken a stronger. Take, for instance, the negotiations between Iran and the United States and Europe and Russia about the atomic potential of Iran, where we all know that Mr. Steinmeier played a very good and constructive role. So, Germany is now, since the last 20 years or so, a multicultural nation. 15% immigration background, which is about the same more or less as Sweden or France. And the question is, of course, and that is the daily question in German debate, is there a successful integration or is it a failure? I don't have the answer. I could just say I think it goes a little bit better than in Sweden, for instance. But it is, of course, a difficult thing, and we will see what happens there. They have to deal with it, and they have to deal with it in a constructive way somehow. The comparison, Neukölln is a place, a part of Berlin here, where you have a very high percentage of immigrants. The projects that I've seen there, they are a little bit more promising than the place Rinkeby. Nobody of you know what Rinkeby is. It's a suburb of Stockholm, where you have really more or less created a kind of a ghetto, almost, of immigrants. And it's really not functioning well. So Neukölln can, in that case, consider themselves a little bit more successful. The ironic thing is here that in the east of Germany, they have much less immigrants. They don't have so many immigrants at all, but they have much more critics against immigration and refugees, etc. The good news is that there is a very open debate in Germany. There are no taboos really for what you can say and not say and so on. So it's a very open debate. What has happened as part of this debate is that Mutti, you know who Mutti is. You better learn who Mutti is. That is the Bundeskanzlerin Angela Merkel. They call her Mutti because that is the kind of familiar way of expressing mother. So she is the German mother, Mutti. And she has been criticized in a way in the last few months or half year that has never been before. She was, let's say, beyond criticism before, but in the last half year she's very much the subject of criticism. And the leading part in that is the new party Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. And they are, of course, they are anti-refugee. They are also anti-Euro because they feel that the way Brussels and Berlin have handled Euro was not correct. It is destroying the situation for, let's say, good guys in the European Union and those who pay their tax and behave well economically and so on. So there is both this financial argument as also this immigrant argument against the government. And they are winning a lot of new seats. They are around 10–15%, which means also here, I see a clear parallel to my own country, Sweden. Also there we have a party, anti-EU, anti-immigrants at around 15%. So the question is now, Germany is perhaps at a crossroads here, and we don't know really which direction it will go. But let's say it's a mixture here of hope and prophecy that Europe will be the priority of Germany as it has been in the last 70 years. So I think it will continue to be a priority. Means also an identity to a large extent. It will remain a leading football nation. And that is important in the future because the role of football is increasing. The Berlinale, the film festival in February, will be remain very important. And that is, again, Berlin has taken back a little bit of that global image. Berlinale very well represents that. Documenta is the great arts festival each 2 years in Kassel, will also remain important because it has a symbolic value. The classical music, well, there is of course the present and future strength of Germany to a very large extent. The cultural whistleblowers is one of the reasons why let's say, the German cultural institution can remain so strong. That is, if there is, for instance, something called the Kulturrat in Germany, it's the Council of Culture, they have a red list, the red list. They say this institution, this museum in Thüringen is now threatened, or this library is threatened, or this orchestra is threatened by financial shortcomings and so on. So they come on the red list. They are blowing the whistle, and very often the result is that these institutions are saved. So. It will become more and more a global cultural center, not least Berlin. I think the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy has found a very good seat here in Berlin because this is where things are happening. The interesting thing, the other day I saw Django. Did you see that? The Western? Yeah, you know, with what's his name, Fox, and Christopher Waltz. And the interesting thing about that, again, if you look at things in perspective, the German, although he's a bounty killer, the German is the good guy. And that is something new, ladies and gentlemen. We have seen so many films in the last 50, 60, 70 years where the Germans are always the bad guys. Not only because there's Nazi time and so on, but there's always something suspicious about that. Even in James Bond films, you always find one or two bad German and so on. But here you have Christopher Waltz being the good guy. And that, I think, is also the new trend for Germany in cultural diplomacy. And finally, last but not least, of course, one of the few words, German words, that are accepted by all languages is the word Besserwisser, which all of you know what it is, meaning knowing more than the others and so on. And somehow the Germans might continue to be besserwisser, a little bit more modest than they have used to be, but still, they will still be some sort of besserwisser. But the new ambition, the chance, perhaps, is also to try to be the world saviors, and that is the new images of German cultural diplomacy. So, thank you. Well, I think I almost kept the time, 45 minutes, but we are, I guess, still a little bit. I don't know if you leave the room for questions, or shall we ask Uli directly?
Of course,
Any yeah, comment or question? Please. You might say who you are and from.
Jan Muhammad from Afghanistan.
Okay.
In 1970s, when the bridge of communication built between the East and West Germany, and which side played more role in unifying these two portions of the Germany? Which side played more roles to unify both sides of the Germany?
In the world, which
inside the Germany. Yeah.
Oh, well, I think there are a few dimensions to look at this. One is simply the numeral. There were more West Germans than there were East Germans. So there were, let's say, some 60 million against some 15 million, or 65 against 15 million. So it was much more people in West Germany. The economy was stronger, and also the world impact of German economy. After all, they had all the big car marks, the Mercedes and BMW, etc. So the economy was stronger. But there was one thing, and that is an aspect of cultural diplomacy. The East Germans, put an enormous focus on the sports. So you would find in Olympic Games, for instance, through the 1960s and 70s, the East Germans winning at least as many gold medals and silver medals and so in the Olympic Games. Then both at the time and afterwards, that say, well, there was some doping involved in these successes as well, but not in all cases. The point was that there was a very strong priority on this. You know, they learned from school age, and they had strong governmental or official institutions for the sports. So, and this was in both in athletics and tracks and field, even in football at the time, and also in the winter sports. So they had a very strong field. In the classical music, in my field, they also were, of course, they had some very strong symbolic orchestras, and they had one big advantage. They could record, they could make LPs and CDs for a very low price at a very high quality. So you would find, if you are for instance, an LP collector of old classical music, you will find an enormous overrepresentation of East Germany in this particular field, because they took the artist from the West to Dresden or to Leipzig, or also here to East Berlin, and they did these records, and they became very strong in that field. So generally speaking, West Germany a bit stronger, particularly because they were more and economically stronger, but East Germany very important in some other fields. Yeah. Okay. Yes, one more, and then I guess we have to go on. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. My name is Haile. I am an Eritrean. The comment that I want to give, and the comment I want to get back is about the tradition in Germany. You say that there were a lot of philosophers. Germany is known for a lot of philosophers. This is true. But I have come across reading, maybe it is too long now, but there was this tradition in Germany, in the thinkers, the philosophers, that there is this superiority feeling like that, and it was that which was exploited by Hitler. There is this thinking, okay? So how much true is this, and what is the status of such thinking today? I can see a lot of symptoms, like in the issue of refugees, that there are a lot of indications that there are a lot of changes, positive move, okay? But how much true is this, and what is the status today about this myth?
I'm not sure I understand your question. What thinking? The thinking of?
The thinking is like the Germans are the best.
Ah, yeah, that one. Okay. The kind of Übermensch, the way, well, people are referring to Nietzsche in that connection, for instance. But yeah. Well, I think that particular part of German philosophy got a almost final blow by the end of the Second World War. Perhaps I go too far when I say this. Perhaps there's now growing again new tendencies in certain parties in Germany for that. But basically speaking, it got a very definite blow. And that, as I said, it made Germans more modest, and also made them automatically speak less about, let's say, German superiority and so on. And Germany was not alone, after all, because Germany was a small colonial power. Britain and France and Spain and the other colonial countries also, of course, reflected the same feeling. We are the colonial masters, and those over there, they are the underdogs. But you're right. There was this feeling somehow, but I think it's you can find it as strongly somewhere else today in other countries as in Germany.